In this video tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to make the sterling silver rope band ring. This is a companion piece to the recent video where I made a bracelet in this style. I'm using 20 gauge sterling silver sheet material, and I am measuring out a piece that is going to make a size 10 ring. And I cut that on a bench shear, and it is going to be 10 millimeters wide. I decided during the construction to cut that down so it wasn't quite so wide, and it ended up being around 8 millimeters wide. So the cut edges, the ones that I'm going to join together with solder, I'm filing those flush using a miter gauge and touch up the burr on all the edges with a number 2 file, and using a flat nose plier, wrapping that band so the ends joined up together, and going to solder that on a solderite board on a rotating tray using Mighty Flux and hard solder. Heating the piece thoroughly. And just remember that solder flows towards its heat, towards the heat source. So if you need your solder to move in a direction that it is not moving, direct your heat. You can also use your pick. So it was pickled and rinsed, and now I'm using the pliers to open it up just enough so I can get it onto the steel ring mandrel. Because this is very wide ring, you want to be sure that you flip it around a couple of times just so you don't get a taper on the ring. You want to make sure you have nice straight sides. And using the large flat rough file and getting that material smooth, and then blending in the solder seam with another number 2 barrette file. And after all of that, touching it up with a sanding block. I'll be using 10 gauge sterling silver half round wire, and how you do this is you measure the diameter of your ring, and since it's not going to be perfectly round, you want to take an average. Mine is 21.95 millimeters. To that, I'm going to add the thickness of the braided material, and again an average. Add those together, then we're going to multiply times pi, 3.14. And that gives us a total of 78.34 millimeters. And so I'm going to cut the braided rope at that length. Just laying it out, putting a small mark there, and wrapping it around the ring just to double check my measurements, make sure that I did my calculations correctly. You can also just wrap your material around your ring. You don't necessarily have to do these measurements. I always like to err on the side of being a little too small. I can stretch it, but if it's too big, then I have to cut it and resolder. So I'm using hard solder here and going to close up the cut ends on the rope section for the ring. Mighty Flux, hard solder, goes into the pickle and gets cleaned up. Now we're going to do the measurements for the half round wire. Same thing, you're going to take the diameter of the ring, the thickness of your material, add that together and multiply that times pi. That will give you the length to cut your half round wire, excuse me. And just neatening up those ends. You can also do this on the miter gauge if you have difficulty getting it accurate just by hand. And joining, buttoning up the ends on the half round wire. And again using hard solder and mighty flux. Placing the seam right over top of the small solder chip. When you heat from above, the solder will automatically wick up into the seam. And you can see that demonstrated very clearly in this shot. And that gets quenched and pickled. And shaping the band and fitting it onto the ring. If it is too loose, you're going to have to cut it and make it smaller. You're not going to be able to fill a gap with solder, and you're never going to get that seamless look on the edge. If it is too small, you can always tap it down the mandrel. Go just a slight bit at a time, because you don't want to overshoot your goal of getting it to where it just fits on the ring. I've got medium solder chips all around between the band and the outer band, the half round ring. And I'm doing a little bit of pick soldering as well. I had flipped it over, so now I'm seeing the outer edge where the band and the outer ring join together, and just pick soldering in there. Using my pliers too to give a little squeeze because I have a tiny little gap there. Can always coax some of those little gaps by pinching them while it's hot. Pickled and all cleaned up and ready for the band ring. The rope band for the ring. And I'm going to put the top band on of the 3 outer bands. And I had decided I did not like it as tall as it was, so I did end up cutting it down. But I am going to stick solder at this point the top band, the top outer band to the inner band. And here I'm just using easy solder. And just going around and filling in. The heat will draw the solder all the way around and seal that closed. There was too much material to file, so using my jeweler's saw, I just cut off the excess part of the wide band. And using the large flat file, I'm going to do the rough filing to get everything level and smooth. And this is where you want to check and make sure you don't have any gaps between your outer band and your inner band. If you do, you're going to need to either add more solder, depending on how much of a gap you have. Some of the tiny little gaps you can fill in with solder. Otherwise, you're going to have to remove the band and make it smaller. So like I said, it's always better to err on the side of too small than too large. And using my half round number 2 ring file, I'm giving a little bit of a chamfer to that edge so it's not a hard edge at the top. And then I'm using a mandrel, sanding mandrel, just a small strip of sandpaper, 220 grit, and sanding around the inside of the ring and also blending the seam at the same time. I'm using a green abrasive polishing disc on one of my rotary tools and just making sure I have everything nice and blended. What you need right here is a completely seamless look. You cannot tell the difference from where one band ends and the other band begins. It ends up looking like one piece. I'm polishing the inside, getting everything really nice and smooth. This is the first part of the polishing. And then I've got a pink polishing disc on one of my rotary tools, and under a magnifying light allows me to see a lot better. And everything went down to the bench buffer, got cleaned up into the ultrasonic, blast out the compound, and you have a gorgeous ring. If you like what we do, please like and subscribe.